Hello, everybody. I am back. It is Sunday afternoon, and I'm having a glass of water, not a beer. Although I feel like having a beer. It's been a long weekend. My face has been like turning red, stressed out, I think. But this is our last week of class, which is both good and bad. I'm right now thinking about whether I want to teach online in the fall if I have a choice, versus teaching either hybrid or in person. I obviously thrive in person. I appreciate it much more. But as I've mentioned a few times, my lungs are messed up and I'm at heightened risk for complications from COVID-19. So I just want to be safe. Your feedback that you've given me so far has been really useful, and maybe I'll give you one more chance to do that. Because I want to do a great job if I do teach online. I just don't think it's ever going to be quite as good. I'll feel a little bit better in the fall if I teach online, because the students, if it's advertised as an online course, I can expect them to do much more synchronous activities. I had a great session on Thursday with the people who showed up, new people, which was really neat. Annalisa and Anna were there. And then, of course, Craig and Jenny that I always love to see. And when you have four people talking and the connection is good, it can be really, really useful. And then in my intro class, we also had some new people. Wait, Anna wasn't in that class. That was that was for the introductory class. My mind is somewhere else. I forget who was there for the Amazonia class. But it was definitely, Kristen, Craig, and Jenny were always there. Somebody else there. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting. Like I said, my mind's in a million places. But yeah, I really want to do a good job of it. We'll do more research if I choose to go that way. Nobody knows what it's going to be like in the fall in terms of university policy, but online teaching is going to be available. Online courses have tended to enroll much better than in-person courses, and hopefully I'll be a little more used to it, so it won't take up so much time and effort for me. But I really want to get some feedback to see what I could do better, and if it's anywhere. It's an interesting experiment now because you've had both, and you can tell me, what's been good and what's been bad. And it's not a great experiment because the one variable we haven't been able to control for here is just how messed up we all are, and tired and exhausted and anxious, and unprepared because of COVID-19. So, obviously the second half of the course probably shouldn't be as engaging, even if I'm doing a good job, just because life is hard right now. But still, I want some feedback, so I want to know if I should make that choice or not. A couple things. Very soon in this lecture, after I do the discussion board post, maybe before, Kristen actually made a fabulous video on Wari phonetics. It's less than 2 minutes. It's an MP4. And it just gives us some great information on how we should have been pronouncing all of these words over the course of reading the Vilasa book. I'm not a linguistic master by any means. Kristen, it's just an interest of hers, and she offered to do it just out of nowhere. It's really amazing to have students just kind of take something and jump with it. It wasn't an assignment at all. She's not expecting extra credit, but it was just really great, and I wanted to share that with you. So I'm going to splice it in here. So please watch that. It's only a minute and 50 seconds, and it's really well done and really interesting, and she knows a lot more about phonetics than I do. And even though on that video I've learned, how I'm pronouncing things incorrectly, like Weesham instead of Weeham, I'll probably continue to use the pronunciations I've been using all semester in this video, and probably the last one for Thursday. I just went over the discussion board posts. There were not as many posts as usual. I think many of you realize, of course, you're getting tired because of the end of the semester. And you have your 6 passes, so you're probably already doing really well, and you don't need to do this. What I really liked about this discussion board was there were only 10 threads, and almost every thread had responses on it, much more like a conversation. I, of course, some people did a response and their own thread, which was great to see. And of course, I liked that most of your opinions matched my own. That worries me a little bit, that I'm like predetermining, your opinion of Vilasa's structuralism. you know that I'm critical of it, even though I think it's really important and really interesting and really brilliant. It's just not what I find most compelling as an anthropologist, as an ethnographer. I especially liked in there that, people clearly had watched the video lecture because they referred to that in their discussion board posts. And I'm actually recording this, after the due date for that one. So I read everything that was on there. It was really good. So we'll have another one today. So this is another one of those. It's going to be a short lecture, but we're going over a lot of material. I, briefly looked over the book, looked over my notes. There's so much. This is historical stuff here. I've entitled the lecture "Wari Pacification: Its Meanings and Its Motivations." So whereas there's myth here a little bit, but the last 4 chapters were all about myth, this is all kind of about history. And there's so many facts about the different Wari subgroups and the evangelical missionaries, the Catholic missionaries, the government protection service, various whites and what they were doing to the Wari. And I'm not going to go over all those details. You don't need to know them. They're interesting. There's some very general patterns here that I'm going to talk about, and especially get to the conceptual point, the argument of these 4 chapters, which really sets us up for the conclusion. Just one chapter for Thursday, in which she makes this case that I've been alluding to the whole time about the title of the book and why the whites are strange enemies to Wari people now. So let's dig in. So the discussion board prompt for Tuesday. Think of 3 words to describe Vilasa's book and your perspective on the portions of it we've read so far. Oh, I already see there's a typo there. We're going to have to change that. And tell us a bit about why you chose the words you did. Your words can refer to Vilasa's writing style, her use of theory, her topic, her mode of analysis, the way she portrays people individually and or as members of a group or culture, her overall argument, or anything else at all. And I feel, we've been fairly critical of this book, but as I told you, student feedback is important to me. The reason I'm teaching of it, there are 2 reasons. The main one is students who wrote their book reviews on it. Last time I taught that class really liked it and said, you should teach this book instead of the one I used to teach, From the Enemy's Point of View. Some of you are writing your book reviews on that and might say, no, go back to the enemy's point of view. But also, I'm working very hard to work towards gender parity and the readings that I assign, just to try to, anthropology and academia in general has, been dominated by men, mainly white men. So I'm trying to make my syllabi a little bit more representative of the people who are, going into the field. Cultural anthropology right now, the great majority of people getting degrees, PhDs in cultural anthropology are women. And more work from other countries, world regions other than, the United States, North America, and Europe are getting much more involved in anthropology. It's a struggle that it's happening. So, when I get a chance to teach a book by a Brazilian woman, I'm going to take it, especially if it's good. And as I've been saying, the best and most of the work coming out about Amazonia right now is coming out of Brazil. It's just a very rich intellectual center. And it's interesting because these people are writing about people who live in the country of which they're citizens and where they grew up, Viveiros de Castro, Vilasa, other folks that we've read too. And there's a lot more. A lot of it's in Portuguese, a lot of it's in French. It's a little bit beyond my ability. I can read Portuguese, but poorly. French, I can't even muddle my way through it. I'll let Kristen write me translations. So anyways, that is a way of saying for this discussion board prompt, if you're critical of it, give me 3 words that convey that, but, try to think positively about it too. The Wari are not the Waorani. They're very interesting. They've been through so much historical shit. And even if you don't like this book, I think in my mind, it's incredibly well done as an example of a certain kind of anthropology. I don't like to teach things that I think are not well done and are not smart, because it's no fun. This really, even if we disagree with it, by disagreeing with something that's really good and really provocative, we help, to form our own ideas about what kind of anthropology we'd like to do and we'd like to see. And only by, picking quote unquote strong enemies or, the best exemplars of a style of analysis that we don't agree with, can we really improve our own. So I'd like to continue teaching this book. I've obviously, all these lectures are new. I put a lot of work into it. I don't want to just throw that all away and not be able to use them again. But if this book wasn't successful for you in this class, then I'll choose something else next time I teach. And once again, try to separate, as I said, the book itself and what it's about from just what's happened to this semester because of COVID-19 and how detached we're all feeling. So if you can give me like 1 out of 3 words, that's like what's good about the book for you, what you've really learned from it, that would be great. If you can't think of anything, be honest. If it's only 3 positive words, that's great too. But yeah, be honest. I'm just curious. So that's your discussion board prompt. So probably right now you'll learn a little bit about Wari phonetics, and here you go.
I'll be going over Wari phonology and how to pronounce some of the Wari words which we have encountered in Strange Enemies. I'd like to say that I am not a linguist and that my pronunciation will inevitably be imperfect. However, I've spent some time researching this, and I hope this can be helpful, or at least interesting to somebody out there. So anyway, here I have all of the letters which are used to write the Wari language with the International Phonetic Alphabet transcriptions to the right of these letters in brackets. These letters in brackets represent the phonemes, which are the sounds, and I will be going over those as well as the pronunciations of specific words. Okay, let's go. So here's the vowels. A, E, I, O, U, and for the consonants, Aka, Aha, Ahwa, Aya, Aja, Ama, Ana, Apa, Ara, Ata, Awa, Asha, Acha, Wari, Tatilim, Wiam, Udoruin, Huitup, or Huitop. Not quite sure about the correct pronunciation for that one. Orupishi, Queen.
And we're back. Okay, so these 4 chapters, they're about pacification, right? This is a word that you really see. I feel like it's most common in Brazil, even in Amazonia and Ecuador. You maybe heard the same thing, but this idea of a government policy to pacify native peoples is really common there. There are still many indigenous peoples groups in Brazil who don't live in sustained peaceful contact with national society or the government or settlers. So pacification is still kind of a thing. I think the terminology must have changed by this point. But this is about Wari pacification, the attempt to pacify the Wari so that they wouldn't be engaged in so many violent interactions with outsiders. And often, as we saw with the Waorani too, who were killing a lot of outsiders, people go in to try to make contact and establish peaceful relations, also to make sure indigenous peoples themselves aren't just killed off in massacres, which has happened to Waorani people, is still happening to the Taromenani, and happened to Wari people too. So often you'll get a Catholic priest who will go out and say, I know I'm risking my life, but if I don't do this, there's a good chance these people will be slaughtered. So I'll put my life on the line and do that. That's what Monsignor Labaca did in Amazonian Ecuador with the Taigiri, that other Waorani group living in voluntary isolation. And if you looked at that PowerPoint, one of the first images was him, and his body was just riddled with holes from spears. He was just speared by them. So he gave up for his life trying to not to convert, actually, the Taigiri, according to him. And I don't think, Catholic missionaries often now don't try to proselytize at all. They're much more interested in social justice. He was trying to save them. And a very noble thing, although a lot of people would say, dude, stupid thing, you knew this was going to happen. Even if they survive, there's protocols for how to do this such that you don't spread epidemic disease. And I'm not quite sure, when he did that in, I think, 87, what protocols he was following. But no, he died. So this is about Wari pacification. A lot about Brazil's Indian Protection Service, the SPI, which is now FUNAI. It's no longer SPI. And the posts, quote unquote, that they established starting in the 1930s to attract. I like this weird seductive kind of language and concepts there. So to attract the Wari so that peaceful relations could be formed with them. A lot of these early posts were abandoned. There were problems. Wari people would come, but there'd be a lack of food. Disease would break out. Violence would break out. Some of them did stick, and now all Wari groups are living, there have been some people who've moved back to other parts of their territory, and I think at the instigation of FUNAI, the National Indian Service, saying, if you're all living at, these kind of posts with schools where we've had, FUNAI services, so much of your land is exposed to being taken over by non-Indigenous settlers. So you need to go out and reestablish remote villages. And some Wari people have done that, but I think the majority still live in these former or current posts. Also involved in the creation and the running of these posts, and Vilaça writes a lot about it, were Christian missionary kind of people, both Catholic and evangelical. The evangelical group, the New Tribes Mission, they've just changed their name to like Ethnos 360 or something like that. They are a very, very, very conservative evangelical group who still sees it as their mission to go and spread the word of God to every last isolated group of people in the world. And there was a big, I'm on the Public Information and Action Committee for the Anthropology Below in South America, the Society, and we write letters of protest about things. And there was word that the New Tribes mission was fundraising to buy a helicopter to contact isolated peoples like during COVID-19, and we're just like, this is just so irresponsible. So we found out later that probably they weren't trying to do it now, and it wasn't quite as bad as we thought. But these groups are out there, to convert these people, to bring the word of God, and in some sense, I understand. These people believe that if these people don't hear the word of God, they'll go to hell and be tortured forever, and nobody wants to see that happen to anybody. But it's a lot more complicated than that. So the New Tribes Mission, and whatever they've named themselves now, they're still doing a lot of this action, and they were doing it, in the 1950s in Brazil with the Wari. So after the 30s, especially in the 40s and the 50s, relations between the Wari and the whites. Craig was mentioning in our discussion chat on Thursday just how hard it is for him to think whites here means something very specific, right? I'm going to keep using it because it's the term that Vilaça uses. The relation between the Wari and the whites had become so vicious, so destructive. So many people were being killed on both sides. Many settlers, many whites had abandoned their farms. In the 1940s, you had the move towards, renewing the rubber boom in Amazonia. Amazonia is where rubber grows wild. And of course, during World War II, all the rubber plantations in Southeast Asia had been taken over by the Axis powers. So where are we going to get the rubber that we need for the war effort? Well, you need people to travel into the Amazon and get this naturally occurring wild rubber, for tires on planes and everything else the Army needs. And that put these people, increase the price of rubber and send people out into areas like the Wari areas and put them in danger. And they killed Wari and Wari killed them. But eventually some of them had to give up because it was just too many people were dying. And we already saw about how Wari, war expeditions and exo-cannibalism were being heavily publicized in Brazilian media at the time. So there was a lot of pressure from the white side to fix this problem. The government ostensibly was trying to pacify Wari people peacefully by attracting them with goods, leaving goods, food and stuff, showing them they're not enemies. Sometimes that would work. Sometimes Wari would just kill them anyways. And kind of privately, these Brazilian private actors, everybody knew they were doing it. It was an open secret, but it wasn't a government effort as far as I know. They were trying to solve this problem by other means to pacify the Wari by just exterminating them, intimidating them, That'd be the nice way to look at it. Violent show of massive force, so they would just run off or stop doing what they were doing, i.e. attacking whites. Or, as we read about before, just going into villages while Wari groups were sleeping and killing everybody, shooting them all, going in with machetes, killing the women and children afterwards, burning everything. A form of warfare that just made no sense to the Wari. We've talked before morally about, this idea of Wari killing as being central to their culture and being a predator, and, the kind of moral or ethical issues that some of us may see as the kind of viciousness of that. But the idea of going in and killing a whole group of people is totally against Wari culture and ethics too. So for them, it was just traumatizing. Just think it's traumatizing for anyone. And the Waorani suffered the same things. So there were these punitive expeditions, the whites called it, where they would go in and, just try to kill everybody to get rid of this Wari problem so that people could return to their farms and return to their rubber areas to extract those resources. And the Wari violence was keeping them from doing that. So it was a really, really nasty time, the 40s and into the 50s for the Wari. Brutal. So, the next slide, this contact, this is a book, it's about cannibalism, but it's also about first contact, right? Those are the two classic themes we see in Strange Enemies. The Wari, for a long time, as soon as they found metal tools, they just knew they were so much better, so much more efficient than stone tools. So they, for a long time, had been organizing these kind of war expeditions to go steal metal tools from whites, from settlers. But then, as part of these pacification campaigns, whites began to freely give them tools, to give them food, and to kind of show their love or their openness, their peacefulness for the Wari. They would hug them and embrace them. And we, of course, right now in the area of social distancing, we know what can happen when you're physically embracing people without any protective measures. It just led to massive epidemic diseases just in a couple of decades. More than half the Wari population died of malaria, pneumonia, measles, influenza, whooping cough, mumps. Just whole villages just slaughtered. Wari people weren't even able to, practice their funerary rituals where they eat the dead. And this is at the same time that the epidemic diseases are killing them, that other, armed gangs are going to slaughter them. Just imagine the trauma of that. So it was a really, really nasty situation. Some Wari who were at the posts, as soon as the diseases broke out, they fled because they, of course, associated the diseases with white people, although they didn't have a germ theory of disease. But some Wari people also went to the post or stayed at the post to try to get medical care so they just wouldn't all die. Something really troubling that Beth Conklin writes about in her book, Consuming Grief, is that at these posts, when Wari people were all dying, the government or the missionary, whoever was at these posts supplying, for healthcare, vaccines and whatnot for Wari people, would only give them medicine to save their lives if they vowed to stop the practice of funerary cannibalism. This isn't going out and killing outsiders who don't want to be killed. This is about Wari people eating their own as part of their own culture, not hurting anybody, an expression of love and care. For the West, cannibals are others. They're not human. And this had to stop. So give up your cannibalism, even if it's not about, eating whites or Brazilians, or else we're not going to give you medicine to stay alive. Really sick and horrible that happened. So Vilasa, though, she sees all these practical reasons why the Wari went to the posts, why they approached the whites. Metal tools, food, medical care. But she says the first Wari group to really go and engage the whites at these posts actually did it because of contact and the disruption. They become totally isolated from other Wari groups. And they wanted to return to Wari society. They wanted to engage whites so they could engage other Wari and return to this life based on the notions of foreigners, engagement with difference, festivals, affinity. So strangely, returning to whites meant returning to Wari society. And this is her kind of deep cultural explanation for why contact occurred the way it did, pacification. There are all these very, practical reasons it occurred, but she said, no, there's this very deep structural, cultural reason. Maybe not. I think, she might be pushing a little bit, but that's what anthropologists do. They look for the reasons that don't quite make sense, that are hard to figure out. And of course, she goes to myth to explain partially one of this. She has this myth, the myth of the one that I have horror, na. Kristen, you didn't tell us how to pronounce that one, stress-wise. And she says, if you look at this myth and you look at the history of pacification of one Wari subgroup, it's almost like in turning to the whites, this group was reenacting this myth. They were following a mythical template. Vilasa says, the Wari do not think that everything is happening is myth. They don't confuse myth and history, yet they use myth to logically make sense of what's happening and to negotiate it, right? This is a large theme in this book. Like, you have two cultures coming in contact, and our cultural categories and concepts and structures change, how we make sense of anomalous new phenomena. And she's showing, or trying to show, how the Wari use their myths to interact with new others in certain ways. So once again, I've got this diagram here of a comparison, not of two myths, but of a myth, the a portion of it, and, pacification. And, some of you feel like it was a little cut and paste, highly structured, interpretive. So if you look at the story of pacification, it's clearly not the whole empirical story, but Vilasa is able to put these two kinds of series of events, this narrative, these mythemes next to each other, and show why mythically, pacification for this group was really about reconstituting Wari society. Not just joining the whites, but joining Wari society, and Wari society being a society based on difference. And foreigners, right? They're not total others. They're other Wari people who are not kin that you have this really complicated relationship with. So at the end of the na myth, you have reconstitution of Wari society because the subgroups separate. You need to have difference for Wari society to exist, difference within Wari society, right? And then at the end of pacification, you have the reconstitution of Wari society because the subgroups mix, they come back together. So it's kind of like an inverse way to getting to the same outcome. In the myth, the groups separate so that society can be born, can exist. In the pacification campaigns, the groups come together so that they can have their festivals, their exchanges, their final rituals and everything once again. So according to her, it's like, they were reenacting this myth. And, you can make of that what you will, but it's an interesting idea. And once again, she's going to use myth to help us make sense of history. Finally, just some quotes to get us deeper into this material, everything I've been saying, and gesture towards the conclusion, which has a lot of, really interesting theoretical conceptual material in there. Page 299 to 300. These are 3 paragraphs, I think, in succession. Returning to questions raised at the end of chapter 10. If the Wari were looking for foreigners, i.e. other Wari, why did they not move away from the whites? Some indeed did so as soon as contact with the other groups was achieved. And why did they not incorporate the whites straight away as foreigners, marrying them? The Wari always expressed distaste for this idea, and turning them into consubstantials. They opted to keep them as enemies, which is how they refer to whites in general, even today. But at the same time, they began to live close to them, right? Strange enemies. In the conclusion, Vilasa tells us that now Wiham, I think that's how Kristen said it should be pronounced, that is just reserved for non-Indigenous people, for whites. Other Indigenous people, they don't call enemies. They don't call Wiham anymore. So they're living alongside enemies. And, if, as she said, if, returning to Wari society by getting in touch with whites, Wari society relations between subgroups have been so disrupted by epidemics and violence. They were all fleeing, living on the run. All of these ritual festivals, exchanges had disappeared, and they wanted to return to them. But she said, all right, they got in touch with each other after reestablishing peaceful relations with whites, and then why didn't they leave whites? Something more must have been going on, right? Next quote. The motives leading them to live next to these enemies are manifold. Clearly, the material goods attracted them, particularly since the whites proved to be exceedingly generous hosts. They offered food and gave many presents. Perhaps the Wari also knew that failure to remain allied with the whites would mean that they would be unable to achieve the social life that they felt could be resumed. Excessive warfare was forcing them to live on the run in constant fear. Makes me think of the Waorani. Though they had not abandoned festivals, they were probably less frequent, especially since festivals are not held during mourning and they were losing their kin in large numbers, right? Once again, this is about more than practical things like tools and medicine and food. It's about, reconstituting Wari society in a way that only a cultural analysis by a really good ethnographer could explain. Last quote. Without wishing to minimize the practical conditions, I do not think that they explain everything. Did they, i.e. the Wari, become dependent on metal tools, sugar, and medicines, knowing that nothing would go back to how it was before? Were they disorganized and afraid following the deaths of more than half of their people? Yes, in both cases. But why did they risk more deaths by approaching the whites? And why do they say today that they're turning into whites? This is the theme of the conclusion. So, it's the balance of power of those explanations. Yeah, they were being slaughtered, living on the run, living in fear, dying of epidemic diseases, already become impossible to imagine life without metal tools. Kofan people say it's hard for them to imagine living again without machetes and salt. And these things become really important to people really quickly. Even in the time of COVID-19, without, access, not having salt, or actually soap Kofan people are really dependent on too. It's worth the risk. So I'm not quite sure I believe that by turning to the whites and not, going back from them at this point, the Wari felt like they were risking their lives even more. They knew they could never attack them again. The whites had become too numerous and too powerful and too vicious, and epidemic diseases were there. But that's an idea. They could have rejoined each other and then left again, but they didn't. Then this other idea, living alongside the whites, the Wari now say, we are turning into whites. We are becoming white. And in the conclusion, she really gets into that idea because she knows it's much more complicated than them just acculturating or assimilating. Something else is going on. Something Wari is going on. Something deeply Amazonian is going on. And that's what we'll talk about next time. So thank you, everybody. That's it for today. And we will see you soon. Let